Welcome back to another episode of Reflect Live, the podcast where stories come to life and hearts are opened. I am your host, Michelle. Here in Reflect Live, we offer a platform for people from all walks of life to share their experiences, their triumphs, and their challenges. It's a space where people thrive and connections are made through the power of storytelling. And today we have something truly special in store for you. So grab your favorite beverage, find a cozy spot, and let's dive into another episode of Reflect Live. Get ready to be inspired, moved, and maybe even crack a smile or two. This is Reflect Live with Michelle.
So the first question I have for you, so take yourself back, when you were newly married and you thought that your relationship was going to last forever. And then you're married and then you end up getting pregnant. And then the doctor tells you, hey, or did the doctor even tell you, hey, you found out after the birth? Tell us a little bit about the journey.
Sure. So, and really, as I unravel my journey, my whole experience is based around raising my son with a disability. Everything that I do and everything that I've encountered related to this world would never have happened if my child was not born with a disability. So I would tell you starting out that, did we have some concerns in the beginning? Of course. My son was a preemie. He was born 5 weeks early. He was 4 pounds, 2 ounces when he was born. Certainly not the most traumatic, but it was a challenging birth, and then, those first few weeks and months settling in. Like a lot of parents who have an experience of autism or a developmental disability, which my son has, it was kind of a slow rollout, so to speak. We had suspected some things, but, he was our first child. Both his mom and myself were educators at the time, but, we didn't know that much about newborns and, young kids. And so the story that I love to tell, first of all, is that I remember at his 18-month checkup, which is usually where they identify if something is not going right. And I remember the pediatrician asked this whole barrage of questions. And she got to the point where she said, well, is he speaking? And we said, he's not really speaking. We're getting a little noise, but there's not a lot of babbling. There's not a lot of communication there and whatnot. And her words to us were, well, what you want to do is you want to go across the street. We have, like the professional building with all the specialists, and you want to go see the speech therapist. And her literal words were, I don't know what they do, but they play with the kids and they make them talk. Take them over there and, they'll figure it out. Well, we did that and it didn't help. And then we did some different tests, got his hearing tested, checked some other things out. Everything else looked to be okay. And then we started off in Illinois here, what's called early intervention, which is basically the state provides you with some free services as far as therapists and things that'll come into the home. And they kind of figured that, yeah, there ain't something right here. And then it was about around the age of 3 that he got diagnosed at that time with what was called pervasive developmental disorder, which is now just autism. Early on, those early years, I would tell you, were extremely frustrating for several reasons. First of all, we were overwhelmed with figuring out what we were
doing. Really quick, Tom?
Yeah.
Can I ask you really quick, when they diagnosed him, when they're doing the testing process, how did they diagnose him? What kind of tests did they run to give him that diagnosis?
So we went to see a neuropsychologist that was actually referred to our family by some other families at the school that I taught at the time. And they did a variety of behavioral tests, different things to check his communication, a lot of things that are what's known as the disability world as ABA kind of an approach. So it was really just this whole makeup of his kind of psychological and, otherwise behavioral development. And that was really what they came up with. And what's interesting about that diagnosis at the time was that it was specific in that it wasn't straight autism, because they said, he definitely has some of the markers for autism, but not all of them. And, but this one kind of fits the category, which of course, again, now everything is just kind of umbrella autism, but again, based on a lot of things that we had observed in the environment and that some of these other specialists who came in the home did, they pretty much decided, yeah, there's an issue. And there was, because as he got older, when kids are young, that's the thing about it. When kids are 1, 2, 3 years old, a lot of them, they kind of show, the same relative types of behaviors, relative type of play, that type of thing. But then as they get older, you see that they're not engaging the same way. They're not having the same interpersonal relationships with kids. He certainly was not communicating. So that was also becoming more pronounced over time. And it just started to look radically different. What the unique struggle was that, and a lot of special needs parents can relate to this, when you have a child with a disability, especially in the early days and you're trying to figure it out, so much emphasis goes on taking care of your child. You don't even have a lot of time for relationships, for friends, just having those kind of experiences. As challenging as it is when you have a young child, it's way more so in that sense. So, we had a very small group of kind of family and friends around us, and they were supportive. But to be honest, there was a lot of head scratching. What really is this? What's really going on here? And again, as most parents do, there's a certain amount of doubt and grief about, is this really how it's going to be? Or, well, let's just kind of dive in here. Let's jump in with both feet and let's really work at this to see if maybe this is something that will just be corrected over time, or maybe he'll kind of grow through and all that type of thing. So where we struggled was
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what's that?
Well, yeah, 18 months.
Well,
wow, that's a long time.
Right. And so, we kind of chalked it up to, well, maybe it's just, something with him. He could just be a colicky kid, as they say. He could just, have some sensitivities to this or that. But again, those things got more pronounced over time. And while those things are getting more pronounced, what's happening, which is a very common dynamic to parents and families like ours, is that we were getting squeezed on all levels. So as I like to famously say, any problems in the marriage or family get exacerbated dramatically. So what happens is you're constantly taking care of your child, but you also have to work, right? Normally, the dynamic that happens in families like ours is the moms, which are awesome. And, there's this kind of phrase out there like, excuse me, autism mama bear. And that was absolutely my son's
autism mama.
Yep. And she jumped in. She handled, very, organized and very clinical mind, and, handled the insurance and the doctors and the therapies and all of these things, which is great. But in a lot of cases, what happens with the dads is that the dads just kind of throw themselves into their work and say, well, we have to make all the money to support these things. I'll make the money, write the checks. Here you go. Our problem was that we were both teachers, but my ex, his mom, always made more money than me. She was technically always the breadwinner. And then what happened is that, my ex, again, being a great mom, but also being kind of very type A controlling, I've got this. And then we actually had a lot of support from her mom, which she was kind of wired the same. And it created a dynamic where I felt myself just being edged out. I was dad, but I was just kind of there. And if I wasn't the breadwinner, and if I wasn't doing all these other things, what was my value? What did I actually contribute? Now, I will say that I enjoyed spending a lot of time with my son, because many times if, my wife was working late, or, when he was very young, she actually had a second job on the weekends. So I spent a lot of time with him, and we connected, and it was great. And regardless of his disability, we still did all the typical parent, dad kid stuff, going to parks and museums and zoos and all this stuff. And it was a great time for me now looking back. But again, what was slowly happening was that our marriage was eroding because we did not have a faith foundation. We didn't belong to a church. We weren't really spending a lot of time with each other, or had other people in our lives that we were very social with. And so everything was just kind of getting pulled apart at the seams. And it's a dynamic that you see with parents, regardless of the disability, and even in healthy marriages, or even marriages with a faith foundation, they still get squeezed. And that is also why the divorce rate among our families is, really so astronomically high.
When you reference the word squeeze, what do you mean by that?
So, for example, when you have a typical child, right, a typically developing child, of course, you have to make sure that someone is taking care of the child, whatever that looks like. Mom takes a turn, dad takes a turn, all that. But the issue with him was that he could never be left alone. There were certainly some safety risks involved in terms of him not, you just couldn't let him alone to play, kind of a thing. You always had to be watching him. And again, where it got squeezed was, one, financially, because again, we weren't making a lot of money, and insurance covered some things, but not all. And again, because we wanted to fix our child, we threw ourselves into everything. So many things insurance covered, some things didn't. But then going back to that point about not being the breadwinner, we also went through a season that was, probably, as I look back, the most challenging season of my life, where I had a job loss and we started to really suffer financially. And because of that, there started to be this resentment in the marriage because, my ex, the autism mama bear, was handling all this stuff. She was technically the breadwinner. We have a child who constantly needs our support and attention. So we weren't really having time to connect as a couple. And that gap, and again, highlighting the resentment, but also the guilt of, I'm not doing enough and what is my purpose and what's my value, that was just kind of tearing us apart. And the season of life that I'm describing, it started to amount to, financial woes. We almost lost our home. We were kind of on the verge of divorce, although we never separated at that point. And again, we had no real community. We had no faith foundation. We were really on an island. And so therefore, anything that could go wrong did, that type of a setup.
So John, really quick. So when he was 18 months old, you guys were married, doing the school thing and all this stuff. I don't know how old you are. We might be in the same era. I'm not really sure. I don't know.
I'll be 50 next.
So nice. Well, I'll be 52. Well, I actually just turned 52. So there you go.
Okay.
So I don't know how you were raised, but we were raised with the paddle, the whatever you can do, beat yourself in submission, one of those things, right? So if you were raised in that same dynamic and you have a child that is turning 1, is turning 2, and being disobedient, quote unquote, right? Disobedient, getting into everything, not listening, you don't have the diagnosis yet, and people telling you, well, you haven't spanked him enough, well, you haven't disciplined him enough. How did you go through all that in the same era? How we were brought up is like, if you spank them into submission, they're going to be okay.
So that was interesting because my ex and I kind of came from two different worlds. She actually came from more of an upper class, wealthier environment. I came from a typical blue collar kind of a home where exactly what you described was the case. Neither of us, and I like to famously say, I probably learned more from what not to do from my dad or my parents than what I actually, learned that was helpful. So it was never an issue where, we were afraid that we were going to, physically discipline our child. And that wasn't anything that we were getting from anyone. But the one thing that I will highlight is that what's challenging is that frequently behaviors like my son would show, which weren't necessarily, I won't call them naughty, but some of them were definitely unsafe. Most people who don't truly have an awareness of this will look at it from the outside and see it as defiance, right? And so if it's defiance, just correct the kid. Sometimes, like you're saying, it can mean the paddle, hopefully not, or maybe it's a time is kind of the thing these days. But the reality is that it's not defiance. With the level of autism he had and developmentally challenged, he really just didn't know. He was just reacting to his environment, and it wasn't a conscious decision. I'm going to do this because I want to. It was just what he did. I will say that my family, specifically my mother, my father had passed away years ago, but my mother really had a hard time with this. And again, coming from her own upbringing and the way she raised me, which is, kind of very, black and white, cut and dry, kids with autism, they were just locked away. You just never saw them, kind of a thing. And so this idea that, wow, right, exactly. So the fact that he was actually having what would resemble a normal life as far as attending school and going to school or doing these things, the assumption on her part was, well, he's normal, but maybe he just has a couple of things, as opposed to, well, yeah, but there's a lot of other stuff here. And again, my mother's response, and my ex and I also came from two faith backgrounds. I was raised Catholic, she was raised Jewish. So, in my family's case, a lot of it came down to, well, and we just need to we need to say the rosary more, put some holy water on him, and that'll fix it all. And that's not how that works, kind of a thing. So so it was probably challenging more so on that end. But I think for his mom and I, we did everything we could to appropriately try to address his issues. But again, what made it really challenging was that his case was that he just didn't respond to a lot of these treatments or therapies in terms of things turning around, doing a 180 or some astronomical leap or something. It really was a very slow progression, and maybe you saw a couple of upticks in terms of moving ahead, but it wasn't much. And again, that's where again we just felt ourselves in that pressure cooker.
Yeah. What was the turning point of your divorce?
So that's a long story. What's interesting is that we were on the verge of divorce in that season I just described, what saved us was Jesus, quite honestly, because at that
So tell
time,
that story because that's very important.
yeah, absolutely.
So let's break it down. So you wasn't going to church. You guys wasn't attending church. You wasn't doing anything. You're trying to do it by yourself. And then you said that, turning point was Jesus. So how did you get into Jesus? Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So we started to figure out, kind of based on everything I just described. We didn't have a community, right? We didn't have anything structured like that. So we started to have conversations about that. Now, I will tell you that when we were first married, one of the things we said was, we're not going to belong to any structured institutional anything, church, temple, whatever. But then we said, we think we need to belong to something. So we actually tried a Unitarian church first off. And I don't know how much folks know about Unitarianism.
No idea what that is.
It's church for atheists.
Is that right?
Well, you can. So my ex and I were actually very much into kind of the secular New Age spirituality. And so you found a lot of those folks there. We believe in God, but we don't know about any of this other stuff.
Gotcha.
We just know we believe in God and we're spiritual and we just want a place to go on Sundays. And
Can I ask a question, John, really quick? Were you guys in a rocky space and then you're like, hey, let's go find a church. Maybe that'll save our marriage?
I think that was a big part of the motivation. I think it was, we just felt like we were on an island kind of a thing. And not that church was going to fix it, but that definitely it was something, it was a piece that was missing and we probably needed to belong to something. And again, I want to emphasize here, more of the focus was on community. It wasn't necessarily on finding God because we thought we were okay there. It was more on finding the community, and an environment like this was actually fine for that on that level. But I'll tell you that, we were there for probably a year, and there's one story that I love to tell. And it was after we had been there about a year. And I actually weave this into some of my presentations when I give it. But I remember during that summer, they had a men's group. Okay. And again, when you think of church, you think of like a men's group, a Bible study, that type of thing. This was just a bunch of guys that got together, weekly on like a Friday night. Now, what happened was, I remember I was there for, that meeting, and I was sitting in my car. I was there early. I made a couple phone calls. I called a couple of my oldest friends from the past, laying all this out. This is what's going on. And again, I'm looking for help. I'm looking for support. And I'm listening to these guys respond, and they're like, dude, I got nothing for you. This is just too much for me. They were married, no kids yet. It was just too far out of their comfort zone. And so I go into this meeting and I'm thinking, okay, most of these guys, I was the youngest guy there. I was still in my 30s. And so most of these guys, were at least probably 20 years my senior. I was definitely the youngest guy there. And I'm thinking I'm going to get some sage wisdom, support, something. And they kind of do
sage wisdom.
Yeah, right. Yeah, just because of age. Yeah,
well, right.
Wisdom. That comes with age and experience and all that kind of stuff. Right.
I've never heard that before. Sage wisdom.
Okay. Yeah. They weren't saging anything. It was just that they were. They had some life experience. So
I see.
So I'm I share the story because we kind of do the check in the beginning, and the whole room was silent. Just literally silent. And then at one point, the group leader chimes in and says, you know what? I'm really sorry to hear that. That's really tough. But what you need to know is that it's going to be okay. Now, here's the thing. In the grand sense of it, do we know it's going to be okay, especially if we're in Jesus? Absolutely. But we didn't have that. That wasn't this dynamic. And if you're in real crisis, that's the last thing you want to hear. You want someone who's going to step into your life, walk alongside you. What can I do? How I can help you? So right then, based on that experience, first of all, I knew I had no community. I had no real support. And I also started to feel like this was not meeting my needs spiritually, at least for myself. So what's interesting is that my ex, who was, again, teaching, worked with a woman who was a devout Christian. And the two of them started having conversations. And my wife asked about a men's group, like, does your church have a men's group? Because I think John could really benefit from that. And so it was, probably not even a few weeks later, I attended a men's Bible study for the first time.
Outside of the different church.
Yes, right. Yes. Yeah. So this was an evangelical church that she attended. So I went to this meeting. Now, again, mind you, I was raised Catholic. I knew my Bible, but again, it was a different experience. And what I found was the total 180, just like a complete opposite experience from what I had at this other men's group, because these are guys that didn't know me from anybody. They asked questions about me. They wanted to know what was going on in my life. And then at the end of the meeting, and I just remember how profound that struck me, because I just met you guys a couple of hours ago and you're praying for me. that's big. So I came home that night totally changed, and I knew I was changed, and I didn't quite understand everything, but I'm like, I'm doing this. I'm going back and I'm committing to this. And even my ex said, wow, you're different. And I said, yeah, I know. So as I look back now, I know that was the night I actually was saved, although I didn't know it at the time. But by that point, that was the road I followed. And shortly after that, we actually started attending her friend's church. And my ex and I had some of those conversations. And she's like, yeah, let's do this. So we attended.
At that night, did you actually accept Jesus in your heart, or you just felt his presence?
I would tell you that I felt his presence, but and so if I could tell you the exact, again, I look back on it as saying I knew that moment that's when I was saved. So I felt his presence, I felt the Spirit speaking into my life and kind of just with me. And so, can I pinpoint the exact moment? No, but it was pretty much right after that. And I
ever asked him to be in your life, and like, have you ever did like the salvation prayer?
I did do the salvation prayer, with one of the guys from the group a little bit later on. But again, it was one of those things where, again, this was a fresh experience for me. So I said, hey, listen, this has meant a lot to me. And you know what, I am committing my life to Jesus. And, so that was something that they did do. So, I mean, if you want to look back on it and say, was it that moment? Sure. But I knew that night that I came home that I was changed, and it was because of him. So. Yeah.
So your experience and your revelation, we'll call it still didn't stop the divorce.
Well, yes and no, because here's the thing. We didn't get divorced then. Okay. So our marriage actually lasted several years after that. And I would tell you that things had improved and actually were really good. Here's what's interesting about it. We did have to bounce around to a couple of different churches because of my son's disability, and not every church could support it. We actually were part of a great church for several years that really supported him, and we really grew in our faith. And what was interesting was that for several years, I jumped in with both feet, and I belonged to other men's groups, and I got involved with church, and, we were in a small group, and, I did a lot in terms of volunteering and getting involved with just some different outreach in the church. Where the divorce came in was several years ago, I started to kind of feel the call of the Holy Spirit to say, your life has been restored, your value's been restored. Now I need you to give back. And the way that happened was, so the organization that I work for now, which is Johnny and Friends, they host retreats for families of disability. These are Christian retreats for families during the summer, and we had attended every year for several years. I started to have a desire to do some writing, and I didn't know what exactly that was. But I connected with some of the families from there who actually, were involved with a bunch of different stuff. And it was one mom in particular who connected me with a small Christian ministry that worked with disability families. And they said, hey, we're always looking for, guest writers for like our blog. Do you want to try it? And I was like, I'm not sure if it's my thing, but sure, I'll give it a try. And what that did is that slowly turned into me working with bigger ministries around the country, doing writing and eventually doing speaking, telling my story as a special needs parent and as a dad. And then, really kind of making all of these wonderful connections in the disability world, mostly Christian, but also with some other organizations as well. And what's fascinating about the divorce and how it happened, and when I tell the story in my presentations, I actually describe it as a tale of two parking lots, because I told you the one parking lot story when I was outside of that Unitarian church for the men's group and I was lost. What's interesting is that after several years, and it actually happened on Black Friday, which is the day after Thanksgiving, can't make this stuff up, my ex just out of the blue handed me divorce papers. Basically just, I'm not in love anymore. So here's divorce papers. There was no infidelity. There was no, I'm not a gambler. I'm not a drinker, none of that. It was just not in love anymore. I do know from some of the conversations we had through our counselor, because our marriage counselor actually served on the divorce team, that somehow this work that I was doing, it wasn't something, I thought it was something she supported, and then it turns out she didn't. And maybe she felt like I was, and I never intentionally let it affect the marriage or the family, but somehow that's what she was feeling or something. And whether that was the only reason or not, I really to this day still don't know. But essentially, we wound up divorced in 2020. So obviously that, like anyone, that might shake your faith. For me, it really didn't. I mean, I was certainly confused and I didn't understand why. But what I did know is that, Jesus never left me. So the reality is that even through the divorce and even through, just everything that, takes place, when you literally have your family torn apart, my faith didn't waver, and I continued doing the work I did because I knew that it was what he had called me to do.
So can we talk about that a little bit, John?
Yeah.
Because I'm divorced, and I was just brought up in religion, and the church backing, and we were, anytime the doors were open, right? Sunday night, Sunday morning, Wednesday night, anytime the doors were open, we were there, right? And so when we got a divorce, the church abandoned me, right? Just because divorce is not in the church doctrine. You're supposed to stick it out. Divorce is for a sin, this, that, and the other. So my experience with church is that as long as you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, they love you. But when you have a divorce, or when you're doing something outside of God, they don't want anything to do with you. Did you experience that?
Absolutely not. I can honestly say that
Wow, that's great.
Total antithesis experience of that. So basically, when that happened, again, and going back to that parking lot story, now that I had community, now that I had support, I leaned all the way into it. And everybody, especially my Christian friends, were there, and all of our church friends who were really shocked, confused, didn't understand it. Now, again, I didn't go to them saying, my wife is a bleepity bleep or whatever.
Right.
But I said, listen, I'm profoundly hurt, I'm lost, and confused. And I will say that all of them absolutely showed up. And to be fair, they said, listen, even one of my pastors at the church that I'd known for years said, listen, don't apply logic to this. There's no logic here. You have to just accept it, but know that you lean into your faith because, God's still with you, and God still, makes beauty out of the ashes, kind of a thing. So I would tell you it was great. And what also really struck me was not just how the folks at my own church or in my own community, friends of mine and all that stepped up, but I had people around the country, a lot of these folks who, I had met through disability ministry and again, who are pretty well known in that world. They were all, praying for me and reaching out and checking on me. So I had a wonderful experience in that sense. It didn't take away from the pain and the grief. I still had that, but it really made it a lot easier for me to move forward. And remember, I was still a dad. That didn't stop. And I wasn't going to stop being a dad. And I wasn't going to say, okay, well, now that I'm divorced, I'm just walking away from this. It was no, I have my son, and I'm, nothing is going to change that for sure. And if anything, it gave me another layer to my story to be able to share with guys to say, listen, I know what this is like now. I have this experience. I know what it's like to be a special needs dad and a divorced dad. I can speak to it. I can relate. And it's important for guys to know how important their role is in their child's life, regardless of, what that situation is with the mom.
Do you know if the roles were reversed and they rejected your ex?
I think there were a lot of folks who were definitely confused by her actions. To be honest, I don't know how many people even reached out to her. I think probably a couple did. But the reality is that I think she, going back to that conversation about being the autism mama bear and being so, kind of type A and organized and all that, I think she already had an idea in her head about exactly how this was going to go. So I think she knew the people she felt comfortable talking to or not. And it was one of those things where I had no problem telling people, guys, this happened. I'm in pain. I need help. And that also wasn't her personality. I think she kept more of that close to the vest and didn't want to kind of put that out there where I'm like, hey, this happened to me. I'm not afraid to share it. I need help. I need support. And I'm not afraid to ask because I know that's what I need now. And I also know that, God had allowed me, and this is an interesting thing too. And I think you'll appreciate this because one of the struggles I had when it happened was you kind of have these two schools of thought of, well, God, allowed it because, well, he knew that he maybe had work for you to do, or there was something about the marriage that maybe was holding you back. And then you have the other school of thought that is, well, it's still sin regardless kind of thing. God can still make something great out of it and beautiful out of it. But don't ignore the fact that divorce is still sin, whether it's, you initiated it or not. And so I really had to struggle with that because I would get, those two kind of competing beliefs. More often than not, people said, hey, listen, we don't understand why it happened, but we know God will repair it and God will fix you. And so that's what I leaned into. And actually, I'll tell you one really beautiful story. So this was the day after I got handed the papers. And I texted a very close friend that we had actually attended church with in his family. We were very close to, believe it or not, because again, this was Black Friday when this happened. So these are folks that were just at our house for Thanksgiving the day before. And I'm texting him the next day and I'm like, I just got handed divorce papers, and he thought I was kidding. He's like, yeah, okay, yeah, that's, and he's like, well, wait a minute, you're serious. I'm like, yes, I'm serious. So a couple of days later on the Saturday, I was going to meet him. We were going to, sit down and talk, but I had some time to kill. So there was a Catholic church in the neighborhood that was very popular with a lot of families. And again, I, was raised Catholic. I had been Catholic for years, but I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to go talk to a priest, because why not? And I went in and actually went into a confessional, and I talked to the priest and I explained my situation. And, he was very understanding. And his advice to me was this. He said, I want you for the next week to say the Our Father, the Lord's Prayer. Mm-hmm. And I want you to say it each day for a week. And I want you to say it very slowly and very intentionally. And I want you to see, what jumps out at you, what things kind of strike you or, come into your heart. And he said, now I want you to think about that first line of that prayer, Our Father. What does that mean to you? And I sat there and I said, well, it means I have a Father in heaven who loves me. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, he loves me. He's not going to abandon me. He's here with me. And okay. And what else? And I was kind of stumped. And he said, if he's your Father, that means you have brothers and sisters in Christ who will walk with you, be with you during this time. And I thought that was very profound and very helpful, because that was exactly the experience I had. If it was not for the support system I had, if the John from 2012 who didn't have Jesus and didn't have all of this community and support, I don't know what would have happened to me, quite honestly. But this John actually had all of those things as a cushion. Whether I knew it was going to happen or not, God probably knew. And so that was all at least prepared for me.
This episode's podcast sponsor is brought to you by Grief Relief Support.
In the journey of life, we all face moments that test our strength and resilience. Loss and grief can feel like a lonely path, but you don't have to walk it alone. At Grief Relief Support Group, we understand the weight of your sorrow, and we're here to share the load. Our grief support group offers a compassionate space where you can speak freely. Whether you're coping with the loss of a loved one, navigating life changes, or seeking solace and connection, our support group is here for you. Together, we'll explore healing paths, share coping strategies, and rediscover hope. Grief Relief Support Group. Join now, www.griefreliefsupport.com.
Now back to the podcast, and make sure you like and share so other people will be able to catch future live stream episodes.
And this John stay in the Catholic religion?
You mean John today or old John? Or
you? Yeah.
Well, you know what? It's what I was raised in. And I will tell you that, when I went to a Catholic elementary school, and then for high school, I went to a public high school. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I believe in God. I just don't think it's here. I'm not jiving with this. I'm not connecting. And so I was like, it's just not for me. Now again, I'm also someone who I'm really a person who I'm not just, yes, I believe in Jesus on faith. Absolutely. No question. But I also need to understand my faith. I've got more of a critical mind. Like, I'm not just going to say I believe it because I believe it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that was an issue with me with the Catholic faith was, I wasn't just going to say I'm Catholic because I was raised it, and I don't know. I guess that's just what I do. I could logically say, well, I disagree with Catholicism because of these things, right? And so now, of course, being a Christian, for over the last 10 years, I can say, okay. I'm not trying to say Catholics are wrong or bad or anything, but I understand the difference in my faith as opposed to what I was raised with. And especially with a lot of the things, that I saw my parents do. For example, like, we had a Bible in the house. It lived in the closet on the top shelf, and you didn't touch it because it was more of like an icon. It wasn't something you actually took out and read and learned from and talked about. It was, that's the Bible, don't touch it.
Right.
Okay. Or, my mother having this experience of we can fix him. Let's just say enough rosaries and put the holy water. And, I sent a prayer into such and such priest over here and nothing happened. Yeah. Well, that's because God's not a magical lamp or a genie. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, the more you pour into him, and it's not to say I understand everything. I don't, but I trust and I have faith, and I've seen him work in my life. And so, I have no reason, I'll also famously say, it's easy to have faith. And I actually speak a lot to faith, especially in some of my presentations. And I say, faith's easy to have when the worst thing that happens to you is you spill your coffee on the way to work or someone cuts you off and,
Sure.
gives you the finger or something. It's hard to have faith in the truly hard times, but that's when you need it the most. And I figured if I'm not going to have faith now, then when am I going to have it? Right.
You're exactly right. So what does your parents think back in the day when you said, "Hey, I'm Christian now"? What were their opinion?
Well, my father had been gone for some time. My mother actually, we would bring her to our church. She actually enjoyed the experience. I mean, it was very different for her, but again, it was one of those things where, and I'll actually tell this funny story. My mother at one time asked me if we were going to baptize our son, because again, Catholics believe in, infant baptism.
Sure.
And I told her, well, no, that's not what we do at our church. Like we believe Jesus is a choice, and if he wants to make that choice, and even with his disability, he can still make that choice, whatever. And I said, why are you asking? And she said, well, so he can go to heaven. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so because I was baptized as an infant, that guarantees I'm getting into heaven. Yeah. But oh, by the way, my child did not have that baptism, and neither did my wife. So are you saying that they're going to hell? No. Well, what are you saying? Right. So again, it's this conversation about, you're Catholic. It's like, well, actually, no, I was raised that way. Mm-hmm. I have a different belief, but oh, by the way, my faith is in Jesus, not in any of these other things.
Yeah, it's good stuff. So now your son is what, 13, 14?
16.
16 now? Oh my gosh. All right. So you transitioned from divorce and you have your community of your church and everybody standing behind you. You're going on the road speaking and this, that, and the other. How have you evolved from the divorce, which, been there, done that, right? So I can totally get it. In the stages of divorce, right, there's grief, so you go through the whole stages of the whole grief process. So walk through all that, trying to raise somebody with autism. Like, talk to us talk to us real, John. Tell us about what you went through, your struggles, you yelling at God, be like, you think I can handle this? You say I can handle this? Walk us through that.
Well, I'll say this. It would be so easy for me to, come on here and say, I had Jesus and that just made it easy. Yeah. It wasn't easy. It was not easy. I think the real challenging thing for me was the loneliness, because I'm actually an only child. I have extended relatives that I'm not as close to, and my son's an only child. And so it really turned into one of these things where it was a lot of times just me and him. And of course I had friends, and of course I had, even family that would lean in. But as you probably know, and it's kind of the same way when you have like a death in the family, people check in, people are there, but then life goes on, and people have their stuff too. So it's not like, I've got 20 people texting me every day, how you doing? Now, I do have close friends that check in with me almost every day, and that's great. But the fact is that I will tell you, it was a real struggle. And oh, by the way, we got divorced right when COVID hit. So on top of the divorce, you had COVID. And then on top of that too, and I could really do a deep dive here, but just to give you the big overview. Again, my father had passed away years ago. My mother started to have significant health issues, and I actually had to transition her into an assisted living. And again, being an only child, even though I had a little help from family, it was mostly on me. So it was kind of this everything at once conversation. But, here's where I kind of found solace in it, was the fact that I also saw God's hand, because I also saw how he had almost uniquely prepared me for this, because not only did I have the support I needed for the divorce, but even with my mom's stuff, as challenging and frustrating as that was, with COVID, it allowed me to, because I was able to work from home. And then I actually, unfortunately, during COVID, the job that I had, was eliminated, and I got
Wait, hold on a minute. So you're getting a divorce. Your mom needs to go in a nursing home. Your job was eliminated.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
No, it's a lot. But what I also saw was I had the support I needed for the divorce. The timing was divine in that, because I had a couple months off, I could address my mom's situation in full and really focus on that. And I found that also too, and again, there's a million little stories I can tell, which I won't get into, but it was interesting how the people that I needed, whether they were professionals as far as, helping with navigating some of those things, or just the friendships, or whoever I needed was just there when I needed them to be there.
That's good.
That ain't me. That's him, right? Yeah, because there ain't no way I'm explaining that away. So it was this understanding of, listen, this is going to be hard, but I have prepared you for it. I've equipped you, everything will line up the way it needs to. And again, it's one of those things where, people, because I have non-believer friends still, and, I love them, whatever, but, sometimes we'll talk about this stuff and, well, you and that Jesus stuff. Hey, that Jesus stuff is all I got, because I'll tell you what, with him, I knew that I was still going to be okay. I didn't necessarily always know how, but I trusted, and I just made sure that I kept going. And again, he's really unraveled one blessing after another in life. And again, I can't explain it or put it together any other way. And so the John here today, I mean, am I, do I still have scars from all that? Of course I do. Of course I do. But you know what? I still have my son. I still have all these wonderful relationships. I do work I love. I'm actually engaged now, as a matter of fact. So I've met, a wonderful, Christian woman who loves me and loves.
Talk about her a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what's cool about that story is that so my organization that I work for full time. So again, we do these family retreats. She's actually a volunteer for our family retreats, meaning that, when we have families of disability that come, whoever that individual is, they get like a one-on-one buddy for the week, that kind of thing. Well, that's kind of the role she serves. We had taken my son there for years, and now that I'm working back for them, last summer I took him. It's the first time he had been back in years. So, I mean, I was technically staff, I was working, but he had a buddy so I could do what I needed to do. And then we were just kind of there hanging out in our free time. Well, she was there and saw me with him, and she was really struck by the way that I interacted with him as a single parent.
By your handsomeness, right? You're like,
well, if you say so, but no, I mean, like, she noticed that. And then, it was one of those things where I was working and we were busy. And so we never really talked. And then several months later, we connected on a Christian dating app, and, I saw her and I didn't recognize her at first. And then I saw she mentioned something about our ministry, and I'm like, and then she messaged, you don't necessarily know me, but I remember you from camp and all of this. And turns out we actually, she knew a lot of the people that work for our ministry and all this kind of stuff. And, she loves serving in this way, even though she doesn't have kids with a disability. She loves serving in this capacity and serving this community, and loves Jesus. And when I explained to her, okay, that I work for this, but I also do all this other stuff, she was like, wow, this is cool. And so that experience, and I've actually said this to her, and I'm quite serious, in the short time that we've been together, she's leaned into my life in terms of the work I do, and showing interest and wanting to know about and all of that my ex-wife ever did. Sure. Now that's not a slam on my ex-wife, because maybe she just wasn't wired for that. Maybe she just wasn't made that way, and that's okay. But the reality is that God, whether God had her waiting for me after all of this, or just said, I'm going to turn something beautiful out of this, sure. I can't explain it, but I just know that was him. Yeah. So, the reality is, hey, you know what, like, I'll go with it, because guess what? Not only have I been blessed with, again, still maintaining my relationship with my son, and, being blessed by all these other things, but, God's also repairing my heart and saying, you can actually have someone who loves you enough and loves the work you do and loves your son. Because not everybody can, come into a situation like this, into this kind of dynamic, and understand what it's like to have my son when I do, because again, he has a lot of challenges. It's not just like I have my kid half the time. Okay, well, that's all of us divorced people with kids. No, my son's a whole different deal, but she gets it. So
awesome. Yeah. How did your son take the divorce?
So that's also one of the big bittersweet things in this, because of his disability and because he's nonverbal. You could talk to him about it. Mm-hmm. You could, read the books about divorce and, the kid books with, picture books and all this stuff. How much he really understands, I don't know. And I will say that I really grieved that, probably even more than grieving for myself, because I felt like he didn't deserve to have his family taken apart, because what would he really understand? Where's dad? Why isn't dad home? Why isn't dad putting me to bed? Well, he's with dad when he's with dad, but it's like, how come mom and dad aren't together? And so that's something that I still grieve on some level, because it's just, and I said this, during the divorce, even to my ex, like, he doesn't deserve this kind of a thing. So, and whether or not that's enough to keep the marriage together, that I can't say, but I know that I grieved for him for sure. But I do know that, he also is very flexible and adaptable. He loves being with me. He gets excited for that and whatever we do. He really likes, my new fiance and stuff like that. And so they've got a good relationship. So, I feel like.
How did you tell him? Like, how did you communicate? Like, hey, this is my fiance. Like, how did he get it?
So that's something where, again, you talk to him and you tell him things. Now, I believe for some different reasons, and so does his mom, that he kind of understands stuff. He just can't tell you he understands it, but he gets it. So you just have those conversations, and then you introduce her, and again, usually in the beginning, it's very kind of laid back. We're just hanging out, we're just spending time together. But my son is also a person who, and again, with a lot of kids with disability and on the spectrum, they have different filters for things. So, and in a lot of ways, it's not like you're the new mom or you're the new stepmom. He doesn't have that. He's like, you're a nice person. Here, let me come up and give you a hug, because why not? So that's kind of and then of course, because she's, and again, she has an experience of disability and is a nurse herself, like she has no problem with, jumping in and helping out if he needs assistance, because he does need assistance with just about everything. And she has no problem with it. And I'm like, well, great. I'm like, whatever you're comfortable with, go for it. And he's comfortable with her, kind of a thing. So in his case, I think he's more just looking at the person's heart and character and saying, I like you, you're nice, let's hang out and whatever. So
when you say he needs help with everything, are you talking like the bathroom? Like, what's his extent that he needs help with?
He needs support with literally everything. So like bathroom, he can do semi-independently, but not all the way. Okay. So if he's going to the bathroom, you have to help. You have to help him get dressed. You have to help feed him. He can do those things in part, but not in full. He's always going to need someone, if you take him outside, you can't just let him walk, whatever, because he's not totally going to be safe. You always have to have a hand on him or near him, that kind of stuff. And, he's also a kid who, he loves pushing buttons, literal buttons. So, the stove, he'll push those buttons because they make a noise. The carbon monoxide detector, the microwave, this. I often joke that if he had the buttons to the nuclear codes, we'd all be blown up by now. That looks fun to me. So it's that kind of stuff. And again, he'll never be fully independent. And that is also why, though, and this leans a lot into my professional work, where I work a lot with churches, because what I really try to impart on churches is, as I like to say, the obligation and opportunity churches have to embracing this community, because most churches don't, whether they intentionally don't or they don't get it or understand it. Because in my son's case, again, he's an only child. His parents were only children. At some point when everybody's gone, he will be essentially alone. Yeah. Who's going to be his community, right? Sure. Well, that can fall to the church if the church can engage, right? And so that's where that really is my passion, because so many of our kids are going to wind up in situations like that, where one day it's going to be like, where'd everybody go? Whether he understands it or not. But those folks can still be his community and check in and care for him and care about him. And that's really what I care about. So the organization I work for, my day job, again, is called Johnny and Friends, JONI. If you don't know Johnny Erickson Tada, she's kind of a rock star in the Christian disability world. She has a wonderful story and testimony, way cooler than mine, for sure. And so again, we're a global organization, but we are, we're all over the country. If you're a family that is looking for Christian supports and resources, especially with our family retreats, please check them out online. You can find a local office. I'm in the Chicago area. We cover a lot of the Midwest, that type of thing. But again, I individually work with a lot of other Christian disability ministries and other like-minded organizations. I especially have a lot of resources for dads. So if you're a dad out there, whether married, divorced, whatever, especially with disability, I work with a lot of cool dad-based organizations, specifically one called Special Fathers Network. It's based in Chicago, but it's a national organization. So there's a ton of resources out there I can connect you to. So, I do have a website for myself. It's just johnfelageller.com. You can just go on there and see a lot of my stuff. I will tell you that my friend who does my website, it's not always updated like to the minute. So just throw my name into the Google machine, as I like to joke. You'll see a lot of my other stuff, my more recent videos and talks and all that kind of stuff. And of course, I'm all over social media, so you can just plug my name in and just, kind of follow me there too. So,
nice. And your referrals, are they Christian based?
For the most part, yes. Most of the organizations I work with are faith-based, not all, but even the ones that aren't faith-based, like for example, Special Fathers Network, a lot of the guys that are involved with that and in leadership are Christian, and so frequently, like when I've been in those meetings, or, we've actually do virtual support groups with guys from all over the country for those. And a lot of the guys are Christian who will pray for each other openly and all that kind of stuff. So what I encourage people to do is that, if you are a family of disability, parent of disability, and you're looking for a faith-based thing, absolutely, I'm plugged in with a lot of that stuff. But at the same time, as families of disability do, if it's a good resource, you'll check it out. Although I will say that, for example, we found Johnny and Friends just because another family told us about it. And it wasn't necessarily the faith piece that sold us as, wow, it's a camp for families with disability. Great, where do we sign up? But the cool thing about that is you get a lot of families who are not Christian or lukewarm Christians, and it absolutely restores their faith or brings them to faith. And we've had stories of that too. So that is the cool thing about that. And we've got wonderful testimonies. And in fact, some families I know that specifically came to faith because of that experience. And I know I've talked to families too who have said, look, we'll go to anything. We don't care. And I say, okay, but I just need you to know, for example, if you come to our camp, look, it's a Christian camp, there's no partying, there's none of that, and just have to be respectful of boundaries and things. But if you can engage that way, and as long as you're respectful, let God work, right? Let God work and let God do those things. And, for us, when we first started attending the retreats, we were already Christian, so it wasn't weird or strange for us or anything. But again, it was a level of love and care that we had never experienced anywhere else. And again, that's also just Jesus working through all these folks too. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, is there anything else that you want to talk about or anything that you want to plug?
The only thing I'll say is that, if you're a parent out there, and again, mom, dad, whatever, and again, I really have a heart for dads, but, if you're someone out there and you're struggling or you don't know where to turn, or especially for a community, the one thing about technology is, and it's not that, I think technology is the be all end all, because I think in person connecting is important too. And I still do that with a lot of folks. But the reality is that there's a lot of great stuff out there. And if you don't know about it, or if you haven't found it, because the reality is there's a very powerful movement going on in the church right now regarding disability. And it's growing every day. And it's absolutely not where it needs to be. But I think I'm blessed too in that I'm seeing something very, very cool and unfold. And I get to be just a little cog in that wheel. But, I just love the fact that I get to, rub shoulders with some of these folks that are doing some phenomenal work out there. And I get to be a part of something, every day something new unfolds, and it's awesome. And that's God working, and, all glory to him.
Thank you for watching or listening to this episode on Reflect Live podcast. Next up, Michelle Steiner, April 13th, from 10 to 10:30 Central Standard Time. Register so that you can watch from any device at www.reflectlivepodcast.com. Listen to Michelle Steiner's story as she shares her journey through the challenges of a learning disability during her school years. Despite these obstacles, she has flourished in adulthood, becoming a renowned disability writer, speaker, photographer, and paraeducator.
Listen on Spotify, iHeart, iTunes, or live stream on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram. Register now on www.reflectlivepodcast.com. Follow so you don't miss out on new live